delighted to welcome Cindy, who is a new arrival to the shores of Australia, to Melbourne, and more importantly to South Caulfield, together with her husband Jason and her children. So Cindy, welcome, and thank you very much for agreeing to give us of your time tonight. And certainly a lot of people mentioned to me over messages today, a lot of people WhatsApping saying, oh, what the Zoom details, this sounds really fascinating. And I think we're all going to be really inspired and certainly learn a lot and hear about a really interesting experience that you had in your working career up until a certain point. And of course, your career continues in different ways, but I'm sure there's still lots of excitement at a Jewish school. But if you just want to introduce yourself very briefly, and then we'll get into having the chat. And Cindy has agreed to she's agreed to take questions. So I will gladly watch and supervise the chat box. And someone just asked, how long do the Facebook Zooms last for? They'll probably go for around 45 minutes. We'll see how we go. But please feel free to ask any questions if they come up as we go along, and I will put them to Cindy. So thank you, everyone, once again. Hope you're managing through lockdown for those in Melbourne. And if you're watching from around the world, hope you are doing well wherever you find yourself. Cindy, thank you again and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, I guess. And to Greg and Jason, who totally made me do this. But yes, we new migrants. We arrived in Melbourne 6 months ago, actually today, from South Africa. So yes, a bit about me. I am a daughter, sister, a wife, and a mother of 3 beautiful boys, and a social worker. I always had a passion in life that I was going to be able to change the world, one starfish at a time, and so far so good, I think. I have my moments and my worries. We have another surprise visitor who might pop his head in. I'm just my children don't sleep. Everybody who knows me knows my children don't sleep. 1 sec, sorry guys. So this is
the real interview happening.
Yeah. So yes, I grew up in Johannesburg. I, thank God, had 2 very loving parents who gave me all the love in the world, but we grew up with very simple lives, and I had a lot of help along the way to get where I am today. And I think through that passion of seeing other people help me, specifically social workers, is the reason I am where I am today and why I chose to work in social work. Yeah.
Wonderful. So obviously, as you said, you're a South African native. You grew up there, and then obviously only came here a number of years back.
Born and bred, yes.
Born and bred in South Africa, and you chose social work because you felt like you wanted to make a difference. I loved your little analogy you threw in about 1 starfish at a time. You know.
Well, that's I live by that story. I live by that story.
Do you want to share that story?
I mean, I'll probably get half the facts wrong, but a man is walking on the beach one night after a storm, and he sees someone in the distance bending over and picking up starfish and throwing it back in the ocean. And there's hundreds and thousands of starfish. And he goes up to this man and says to him, "What are you doing? You're wasting your time. Like, there's too many. You're never going to make any difference." And he bent over, picked up another one and threw it back in and said, "Well, I made a difference to that one, didn't I?" And I love that. I love that thought of my actions can change a life because I am a product of that. I know that.
Beautiful. I think that's a great story and a great segue into the next question. I think a lot of people are fascinated about, the work in prisons. I think, prison shows have become really popular. People find it, really interesting to see what happens there. And of course, I'm sure the shows dramatize it a lot. But, how did you, as you say, a young Jewish girl growing up in a bit of a secluded childhood, and you said a very loving, nurturing childhood, but how would you, obviously social work covers a massive array of options. So how did you end up deciding to work in prisons with criminals? And, I'm not necessarily, making an assessment of what type of criminals you work with. Maybe you'll tell us. but that, criminals could also range in a big way. So how did you get into that, and why prisons of all places?
So the ironic part of my life is when I was younger, and even I think in like the early stages of studying, I said I was never going to work with children or criminals, and my first job was juvenile delinquents. So that just sums it up. I was lucky enough to get a full scholarship, and I had to work back my time. So after I finished university, I was employed by the Department of Social Development in South Africa, and I was placed in probation. And I remember arriving at work and going from the one office to the next office to the next office, because that's government work. No one can just tell you one straight answer. And to be told that I was going to be working in prison and with criminals and in court. And I remember just thinking, oh my God, what have I done? Where am I going? What am I doing? And being absolutely terrified. And I knew that I had to work for a certain amount of time there, and I was terrified. And yet it was probably one of the most influential things in my life. And I learned a fortune.
Okay, so you originally you were sort of just placed there, not knowing that this was going to really change your life or change the way you saw things.
So it was also, I mean, I was placed as doing mainly prevention, but as time went along, as you do, you get more responsibilities. So I was going to just be doing like groups in prison, and awareness campaigns at schools and prevention programs. I started doing assessments and reports, and so slowly all the demands started carrying up, and I sort of found a niche, which sounds really strange, with sex offenders, which is very strange because in a million years ago, why would you want to do that? And I started a sex offenders group in Modabi prison in, it's like on the border of Springs, so anyone who knows Joburg, in South Africa, border of Springs and Benoni, so it's quite far out, it's quite far away from anything in the world, I guess. Well, anything in like Jewish world kind of thing. And I used to go there twice a week, much to my husband's absolute dismay. And I would run a group with 12 sex offenders awaiting trial, in a room, myself, them, and nobody else, no windows, doors, anything.
Wow. So tell us just a little bit, in terms of the security or the prisons in South Africa. Obviously, people have a vision for those who may have never seen a prison in South Africa, but compared to what they may have seen on TV shows and movies, what was it like? What did it look like? What were the accommodations like, and getting into the prison, the security level? How was that?
So, before I started, I was given like this declaration that I had to sign and adhere to, that I wasn't allowed to wear skirts, I wasn't allowed to wear revealing clothing, I wasn't allowed to show any tattoos, piercings, or wear any fancy jewelry. And I remember that like anxiety of going in. You arrive and it's these big gates, and your head is exactly what you think it would be. And instead of walking to where the visitors go, I had to go the other way, to where they live. And I remember thinking, okay, it's fine, it's prison, not wearing anything anyone can see. I'm very smart and clever. I was working in the juvenile section. So in South Africa, there's juvenile prisons, and then there's the juvenile sections in normal prisons, which is actually the 18 to 25-year-olds, because they're seen as at risk. And the younger children were sent to Pretoria, to a correctional facility there. And I walked in and everyone's walking around. It's exactly like it is on TV, which I was horrified. I probably walked a good kilometer in to the prison, to the juvenile section. And yeah, they're walking around, they all have daily jobs, whether it be cleaning or washing windows or washing floors or prepping food, they all have their jobs and they carry on like normal life. I mean, they loved seeing me if they loved seeing anyone walking through. So that was very entertaining for most people. So yeah.
Was it, I mean, I guess it's always it could always be dangerous, but I mean, did you feel scared? Did you ever feel threatened? Did anyone ever try and say something or threaten you or do something?
So one of the parts of my job was that I had to do assessments on people, juveniles in conflict with the law. So that was your kids under the age of 18. And so I had to do pre-sentence reports, which is basically a report for someone awaiting sentencing, where I would give a recommendation as to what their sentence would be, which is quite a lot of power. And it was one of my first cases that I did a pre-sentence report for, and I had recommended, so it was a child abuse case, and he had actually murdered his baby. And I had recommended that his other 4 children be taken away from him and he be sentenced to prison as well as his wife. I didn't know what correctional services he was sent to, and I had just fallen pregnant with my oldest son. I was probably about 7 weeks pregnant, and I was walking through the prison, and there's one place you never want to hear your name is while you're walking through a prison. And I heard someone calling Cindy, 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 and I looked at out of the side of my eye and I saw him, and I remember my heart stopping and thinking, oh my God, he knows I'm pregnant. He's going to organize for a gang to kill me. And I was beside myself. I left prison that day. I went to my supervisor and I said, I will do my reports, I will do my groups, I will do everything, but I will not be going into prison until this baby's born. That was probably a very big moment of actually being scared. But beyond that, it was like the beginning I was scared, but you get over it. Prisoners loved me. I was there to help. I wasn't there as their enemy, and they knew that. And they wanted to work with me because I had say, and because I was working with those awaiting trial, they thought that obviously whatever I would say would be gold. I still had to stick to the laws. I still used the Criminal Procedure Act and the Child Justice Act, in order to guide me in what I was doing, the Sexual Offences Act. I used all the acts to guide me, but I could say, look, this is a person that has been trying, this is a person who understands what they've done. And so because of that, it did give me a lot of leeway and a lot of respect from the prisoners.
And when you walk through the prisons, and we'll come back to the Khazan's question in a moment, because it's a very good question. Did you ever how were the guards? How were the security personnel? Were they helpful? Were they just...
So it was a mixture. I remember some of them loved actually trying to freak you out, especially in the beginning when you all timid and new. And I'm quite a shy person, I think. And some of them were great and fantastic and very protective, and they could also sort of be a bit hectic. So sometimes I would be walking through, and the juveniles that graduated into the adult sections or were sentenced and were actually serving time, and they would call out to me. The guards would swear at them and tell them to shut up, and just that was quite hectic for me because I'm not comfy in those kind of situations. I'm not an aggressive person, I think, and that for me made it really uncomfy. I used to run life skills group with 3 other colleagues, purely because I couldn't speak vernacular. So I couldn't speak Zulu, I couldn't speak Sotho. I had to have assistance in doing that. In fact, I couldn't speak Afrikaans, so really my languages are terrible. And I had to have them work with me, and often the guards would come and pop their head in, and they would threaten the prisoners and everything, and that's where you felt scared because you didn't feel like you could do anything about it. You felt your hands were tied because these were the guys that were protecting you.
And did you ever see the guards do things which would be questionable or possibly illegal, hitting them or doing
taking them into a room that we all knew it was. They would take them again. They would take them to a room where we all knew what was going on, and the prisoners would disclose it to me, and I would make a report because I had a duty to do that. That's, as a social worker, I have an obligation. When nothing unfortunately happened.
Now, the Khazan asked a good question, which I think it's probably a question which all social workers, psychologists, anyone who's in that space has to really work hard at putting aside. But I think in your case, it would probably have been magnified, certainly when you were pregnant, and just, you know, talking about that one case you mentioned about the person who killed his baby. But how hard was it to be, or how easy was it, or hard was it to be objective when it came to compiling, you know, the reports about, I guess, about their mental state and things like that?
So it was interesting because I remember in the beginning, I found it really hard to remain objective in terms of not seeing it from the victim's perspective. I had previously worked at a trauma center, and I'd worked with rape victims, and I'd worked with torture survivors. And it was really hard not to sit in a room and see people like this. And then as time went along, and I started to get to know them, and I started to understand that a lot of it was behavior, not the person. And my lenses changed. That was quite difficult for me because it started making me question my own morals and values, which was really, really hard because in my head, I wanted them to be monsters. I wanted to dislike them. I wanted to think that these people were just cruel, but they weren't. They were people that made a mistake. Some not so much a mistake. I'm not putting a blanket over everyone. There were definitely people that I met that pretty much could give most people nightmares, but a lot of these people, there were cultural misunderstandings that led them to where they were. There were people just with unfortunate circumstances and desperation that led them into a life of drugs and crime. And the fact that I started empathizing with them, I found really, really difficult. And then at times I'll tell you about another case. There was a 16-year-old boy who had raped his 21-year-old cousin who was mentally handicapped. And that was one of the hardest cases for me because he was a monster in my head. It was his cousin. It was an abuse of power. It was ridiculous. But the laws in South Africa were very clear. He was a first-time offender. He worked with all the probation officers and social workers. He was very compliant while waiting his trial and waiting sentencing. And so when I did his pre-sentence report, I remember sitting with the Child Justice Act and the Criminal Procedure Act, and my supervisor sitting with me and me going through it like word by word and going, I don't want to give this recommendation, but there's nothing else I can do. He needs to go to a child and youth care facility. That's what the recommendation was. And why it hurt me so much was because here's this man who really committed something horrific. There was no consequence to him. She had been disowned by her family. It was horrible. And he was going to a child and youth care facility where he would get a matric, he would finish school, and he would get a technical degree. And in 5 years' time, he was out. That wasn't fair. And those were the cases that really I struggled with.
Wow. How did you build rapport with criminals? I mean, how did you find, and you obviously, thank you for sharing that, you know, really difficult case, and I'm sure it was traumatic, and well done for doing what you had to do. But how did you build, you said that they really loved you. Maybe it's the wrong term to use, but how did you get them to respect you or to listen to you?
So my Zulu answer is pretty much, I'll say, hello, how are you, and sit down. But the fact that I made that effort really meant a lot to a lot of them, and I would sit and listen, and I didn't come in and treat them like monsters. I treated them like people. And I remember at the end of my first sex offenders group, sounds very weird, especially saying it in school. At the end, I was evaluating, and I said to them, okay, you know, how do you feel this went and everything, and what would you like to say? And one of the feedback that I got was someone said to me, thank you for not treating us like monsters. And that was quite a fascinating way to actually get feedback of how the group went, because, you know, some of them actually learned something, some of them didn't, some of them were just there because, you know, it was time out. And someone to say, you know, thank you for showing us respect and not treating us like monsters was really fascinating.
Yeah. So I think that's a great, I think, so just if I can reflect what you're saying, are you suggesting that you had to look beyond the particular action that they did? You had to try and find the human being behind the action.
Yes.
That was the goal.
Yes. So specifically with, because I know a lot of people are really interested in the sexual offenders. So with them, what I used to do was, before I started my groups, got as much information as I could about them so I could understand what had happened. And that meant I had to have interviews with each of them and hear their story. And I think Nikki asked a question about how do you build empathy with a sexual predator, I guess. And I wish I could tell you. It's sitting there and listening to stories, and at times when you go like, oh my God, I actually understand why they said that. Like, I understand what led them to being there, and I understand like not having this role model, and sort of going, okay, so this is why you did it. Or I always, and most people get really upset when I say this, so please forgive me, everyone who's on here. I always talk about how I met accidental rapists. It sounds the most ridiculous thing, but when I would sit with these guys and they would talk about what they did, rape is about power. It's about asserting your power over someone else, whether it be male or female. And they would sit in this room with me, and I'm a white female in South Africa. I was the best person to assert power over, and I would say probably about 60% couldn't look me in the eye. Their body language was off. They wouldn't want to tell me what happened. The other 40% loved going into every gory detail that they possibly could, because they wanted to see how I responded. And I guess thanks to my training at university, I learned how to not respond. Thanks to working in a trauma center where I really did hear horrific stories, I was able to kind of shut it up. But the other ones, they would tell me stories about how they actually just didn't understand that they committed rape. Rape is it's a Western defined act, well, not even act, but definition. And so a lot of them were taking from a cultural perspective that what they were doing was okay. And a lot of the work that I did was really around what you did wasn't okay. Just because your culture says it's okay doesn't mean it is. Because society, the norms are against it, and you are taking away women's power, and you are, taking away choice. And like a lot of it had to deal with that. The problem for me, and I think Greg at one point asked this question as well, but the problem for me was that I was sitting with people who had already been arrested, who were awaiting trial. They were about to be sentenced. And great, I could get the message across to them. But a lot of them were going to go serve sentences of 5, 15, 25 years. It was falling on deaf ears. It was too late.
Fascinating. So you've spoken about working with men, and I see Khazan has asked about just working with males. And I was going to ask you anyway, in terms of the demographic. Someone else has also asked in terms of, obviously, South Africa being, multicultural. What was the, were you like dealing with, you said you people who spoke Zulu and Sotho and Afrikaans and English. So what sort of demographic and age groups? You did mention sort of working with with juveniles, but can you elaborate further on that?
So my job was split up into different compartments, I guess. The preventative work I did pre-assessment. So what would happen is that was juveniles in conflict with the law, anyone under the age of 18 who was arrested committing any sort of offence, and I would have to assess them and make a recommendation to court if they should be diverted, which meant that it didn't go the court route. They were given a second chance. If it was allowed to be, if they were child in need of care and protection, or if it needed to go into court. So that was one demographic that was both male and female. Different cultures, different races, quite a few different religions, not Jewish in Benoni, just to put that out there already. Yeah. And then I dealt with a lot of adults in terms of pre-sentence reports and victim impact reports, which was another compartment of work that I did. And that was, again, everyone and anyone who had ever been arrested, they could, I think my oldest client was, for a pre-sentence report, was probably in his 60s, and yeah, my youngest client for a pre-sentence report was about 16, but my youngest client in terms of actually assessing was 8. So that was that. And then I worked in schools doing prevention programs, and in prisons was predominantly 18 to 25.
Right. Now, you mentioned you worked with obviously those different demographics and the different cultural aspects of it. Were there any patterns, and Lee Art has asked, any patterns that you saw that I guess led to someone doing particular crimes? And was there any stark differences you noticed between crimes men had committed versus what women had committed? Like, was there a pattern in that as well?
So I started off in Benoni. I worked in Benoni, Davidton. I know a lot of these places for a lot of people is very random, but a lot of informal settlements and informal areas in the east of Johannesburg, which is not like the east of Melbourne. It's not a good area. Don't know how else to explain it. And wait, I lost my train of thought.
So in terms of patterns with movement and men.
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
So depending on the area was what I would see. So I always used to joke with my husband that we would never move to Benoni, and I've got a friend here who actually used to live in Benoni. And I always joked about it because I said, oh my God, I know too much what's going on there. And I would always obviously know where people lived. So generally when kids came in or I got a pre-sentence request, I could look at the address and go, okay, I know what they committed. Because in the more like whiter areas, it was generally shoplifting, drug crimes, assaults, quite a few murder cases. That was quite dominant. In the more like township kind of areas, a lot of theft, a lot of assault. Weekends and public holidays, we knew exactly what was coming. There was definitely a pattern. You could see the unemployment really impacting people. School holidays were absolute torture for us because it was just every day 30, 40 kids getting arrested and us assessing 30, 40 kids. And the interesting thing when you talk about patterns is, so South Africa has the Criminal Justice Act, and then they have the Child Justice Act. And what that meant was that anyone between the ages of 12 and 18 were treated in a certain way, below 12 and between 12 and 10 were treated a certain way, and below 10 were treated a certain way. So I'm more referring to the 12 to 18-year-olds here, where they knew what crimes to commit because they knew the law. And they knew that if they stole something under 1,500 Rand, they wouldn't have to go to court. And they knew that I would have to divert them. They just knew it. And that's where I would see a pattern was I would actually see the same kids over and over and over again who were committing the same crime because I knew exactly what they were doing. They were playing the system.
So now I'm going to ask you two difficult questions, well, possibly very difficult questions. One is, what was the most standout case in your mind that you can think of? I know you've mentioned two really, and maybe those are the ones, but any other cases that really stood out for you, from a traumatic experience? And again, if you don't feel comfortable, of course, don't share with us. And on the second most standout case, was there anyone that you really felt shouldn't have been there? Like you just really felt for this person and you're like, this person doesn't deserve to be here. I wish they could, get another go. So any standout cases that come to mind?
Sure. Okay. So the one case that really, really, I mean, it still sort of plays in my mind when my own children misbehave, I guess. God forbid they'll ever do this. I dealt with a 16-year-old who was arrested. I only did his pre-assessment. He was arrested for axing his entire family in Davidton. And the grandmother had survived, but pretty much everyone else had passed away. And he was normal. He was the most normal child I'd ever met. Like, it was like sitting here, like us having a conversation. And the fact that he wasn't screaming and trying to hurt me or anything, he had a nice chat and told me exactly what he did, and like it was a Sunday stroll. That was one of those cases that just stuck in my mind, and really, I think, traumatized me a bit. That whenever my kids do something wrong, I'm kind of like, oh gosh, you know, they're going to be psycho serial killers because they don't want to eat their broccoli. It's not, it doesn't work that way, guys. So that was a very hard case. He was sentenced to 25 years. In the end, I had left the department by the time he was sentenced, because the justice system is so slow. And a case that I wish the kid wasn't there. It's actually, again, people will really judge me for this. It was a 16-year-old boy who had committed rape with a really young child, and so it's a Schedule 3 offence in the Child Justice Act, which meant that it had to go for plea and trial. And I met this boy, so I got the phone call because I was on what's called like duty to get the calls, and I got the call and I was like, no, he has to go. It's as simple as that. And his mother was arguing with the police officers and arguing with me, and I was like, look, 16, committed rape, it's black and white, I'm not entertaining it. And I went in the next morning and I met this 16-year-old boy, and he was homosexual. And I sat with him and his mom, who was very, very domineering and very dominant, and wouldn't let him speak and wouldn't let him tell his side of the story. And sorry, my kids need my phone. Who they wouldn't listen. She wouldn't let him say his side of the story. And I said, you know, look, unfortunately, unless I know more, it's plea and trial. And the only thing I did feel was that if he went into custody, which he should have been, while waiting trial, he would be murdered, he would be raped. Just something in my gut just said something's wrong. And the next morning I got a card from him. So the magistrate agreed with me that he didn't have to go into custody. And the next morning his mother came and brought me a whole long card, a letter, and he explained pretty much what I thought what it was, that he was homosexual. He was being bullied at school for being homosexual, and he was told by other people, and again, this is where a lot of this cultural thing comes in wrong. A lot of African culture has a lot of funny beliefs sometimes, and I know it's generalizing and I don't mean it in any way, like it unfortunately is one of those things. And he was being told by friends at school that, you know, well, if you have sex with a virgin, you'll kill yourself, you'll be okay. And he watched, there's a program called Third Degree on TV in South Africa, and it was a whole thing about how there's an increase in rape of children, because people were trying to cure themselves of AIDS and trying to cure themselves of homosexuality. Wow. And he watched this, and the next day he tried to cure himself. And it was horrific. It was, I could understand it. I could understand why he did it. I mean, I didn't condone it. I didn't think what he did was right. And he knew that was my feeling, but there was more that we could do to help him. And sending him to court to be sentenced to spend time in prison wasn't going to fix the problem. In fact, it probably would exacerbate it. There's a whole theory around sending a sane person to a mental asylum, they'll go insane. And I thoroughly believe that with prison, especially where the prisons, I'm not actually sure how they are here, but in South Africa, you're not separated. Your white collar crimes are with your rapists and murderers. It's not, everyone's a free for all. And that's a big thing. And I remember having a fight with the magistrate because I said, we're doing the wrong thing. We're not treating this child properly. She wouldn't listen to me. I did manage to get him to go into counselling, which his mother started doing, and I got her into parent skills training as well. And I said to them, it's not going to stop him from getting found guilty. It's not going to stop anything, but it'll show them that you're trying to do the work. And what ended up happening was his case was thrown out of court because the police didn't follow up with something, and he stopped going for counselling. And I don't know what happened to him afterwards. And that's where the cracks happen.
How did you deal with separating your work from your life, your home life? Like, did you bring cases home. I mean, I know, as I said, this is for anyone who works in these really challenging areas, but I mean, what skills do you use to switch off, so to speak?
So the one part was I lived 35 kilometers away from work.
Yeah.
No one knew where I lived. I kept my life quite separate from my work colleagues because I just felt it was better. So that was a big part. Funnily enough, I found it easier to disconnect from that and from hearing those stories than when I heard those of victims. When I did trauma therapy and I was working in the trauma center, I used to come home crying every day. The prisons and the courts and all of that, it was different. I think a lot of it, I was on this high that, you know, people listened to me. I had really good respect. I had really good rapport with the magistrates and prosecutors, and almost like a God syndrome, I guess. But in my head, it didn't affect me. Where I would see that it affected me was if Jason came home 5 minutes late from work, I had phoned CSO, which is like CSG in South Africa. I had phoned my cop friends. I had phoned Netstar, which is a tracking system, because he was 5 minutes late from work. So it kind of like came out in other ways. I used to go for debriefing because I saw the importance of it. I've had counseling to deal with some of the stories that I've heard, and yeah, I just would find little ways to resolve it. I mean, there's nothing like a massage to actually help anything, I've decided.
It's interesting you mentioned about you being scared, you know, after 5 minutes of Jason not coming home when you're expecting him. Obviously, my thesis was on vicarious trauma, and you know, one of the founding theorists of vicarious trauma, in fact, worked with not with the offenders, but with the victims, and they lived in this, and she lived in the safest neighborhood, but he had electric fencing and alarm systems, and really she was carrying the burden of all her victims, you know. And I think
absolutely
taking the vicarious trauma or aspects of it home with you, you know.
Yeah. So I mean, I would see it where I mean, the twins weren't around at this point, but where Ari would, at 2 years old, play rough with the dogs, and I'll be like, oh no, you know, I need to send him to someone because he's going to be a psychopath and he's going to be a narcissist and he's going to be a serial killer. In the meantime, he was 2 years old and trying to explore the world. And those little things, I didn't realize how it affected me until my darling husband would let me know about it. And thank God I had that support with him, because he would tell me to stop and breathe, and he would tell me to look after myself, which if he didn't, I wouldn't.
Wonderful. So he was very supportive.
Yeah, well, he hated me going to prison, let's just be honest.
Now, let's just jump a little bit, because I think a lot of people are probably wondering, you know, going from such a, you know, a non-conventional type of social work, and then jumping out of that. What made you leave the prison system? You did mention that story with with you being pregnant, but you've come to Australia and you've gone to now a Jewish day school, like from A to Z.
So that's Nick's fault. So after I had Ari, my son, I moved from Benoni office to Germiston, and I was working actually in Boksburg. That's how social development works, I guess.
Yeah.
And I remember Ari getting sick and trying to beat the traffic to get home at 8 o'clock in the morning because my child was sick, and it started taking its toll on me. The other part was, as a white South African and like the lower level employed in the staff, I represented everyone because they weren't having a lot of whites entering social development. So I was on every committee, which was a great experience for me. It was burning me out and I was struggling. And then I had a case where I did a standard pre-sentence report. He was an illegal immigrant who shoplifted. It was his 11th case. He had another 11 post cases, and I recommended that he got direct imprisonment, and he got a suspended sentence, which meant he came out and he wasn't deported.
Right.
And that was at Boksburg Court, which was about 10 k's, 8 k's from the Germiston office. And the one day I walk out my office and there he is, and he's like, no, you saved my life and I love you and you're my hero and, you know, thank God for you. And I need to tell you the truth, my wife's not dying. And I was quite scared. But, you know, it's fine. It was in Germiston, he can't find me. And he then got my phone number and he kept phoning me 16, 17 times a day from different numbers. I couldn't block him. And I went to my bosses and I said, like, I don't know what to do. This guy doesn't want to stop phoning me. What do I do? And my boss said to me, well, you shouldn't have given him your number. And I was like, seriously, that's what you got from that? Like, I did not give him my number. I'm not that dumb. And then he phoned me the one day, and this was my breaking point, and said to me, hi, Cindy, I'm in Killarney and I know you live nearby. Please, can you come help me? So Killarney was about 40 k's from Boxburg Court, and it was about 3 k's from where I lived. And that was my breaking point. My job and my passions and what I do in life should not affect the safety of myself, my children, or my husband, or my family. That's not why I was doing what I was doing. And the lack of support that I got from my bosses was just terrifying. And I remember sitting in my boss's office and I was in tears and I was begging for help and I was so scared. And I was told that, well, you know, he's just declaring his love to you. He's not threatening you. And I was like, well, then go declare it to the magistrate. He let him out, I didn't. And she's like, yeah, but you get your danger allowance. So my danger allowance was 160 Rand a month, which is $12. And I was like, my life is not worth 160 Rand a month. It's not worth having. Now I had CSO following my son to school with my domestic work, and, you know, people following Jason just in case. And that wasn't why I did what I did. My time was up. I had served my sentence and working for social development, and I put my feelers out, and I found the Union of Jewish Women, who I had actually volunteered for before, and I loved what they stood for and I loved what they did. And a big part of what I did in prison, believe it or not, actually fed into the work that I did with the Union of Jewish Women, and even feeds into the work that I do now, believe it or not. The one factor that I saw over and over again in the system was that there isn't enough prevention, there isn't enough education, there isn't enough support. And what I loved about the union was that I could work for a Jewish women's organization that gave support to both Jewish communities and outreach. And I'm a very big believer in you give back to your community, both local and outreach, because you're part of that community. And the union gave me that platform, and I could do projects that I really, really believed in. So the union runs an aftercare and feeding scheme in Alexandra, which is a very rundown informal settlement. And for me, that it was the biggest passion for me, because I got kids off the street. They weren't going to be able to be victims. They were being educated. They got support. They got food. They weren't going to be criminals. That one struggle that was facing so many impoverished South Africans, I could help and I could take away. And yes, it was only, by the time I left the union last year, it was only 80 kids a month. But it was 80 kids a month. And those 80 kids would also go on to help others. And that's where I saw it, was that I could help in that way. One of my other projects, like I own the union, sorry guys. But one of the other projects was that we ran a sewing empowerment school. We gave people skills and we helped them. And that, for me, all those things that we could do just meant so much to me. And then on the other hand, we could still run the projects within the Jewish community, where we were doing kosher mobile meals and we were feeding the elderly. All those things really meant a lot to me and helped me develop back into the social work I wanted to be. I missed one-on-one work. That was always a big thing. And immigrating definitely gave me a platform to kind of find my roots again, but still within that arena of, I believe in prevention. I believe prevention is better than cure. And I'm not saying that the kids that I work with now are going to be criminals, definitely not. Okay. But I love being able to work with young minds now, and I never in a million years thought I would say that, but working with the staff and the parents at Yeshiva, I get to see it. I get to see, you know, how you can actually change a life before the problems come in, before the drugs and alcohol and crimes and being lost. We all have that power to make that change. I'm just lucky enough to be able to have it as my job.
Wow. So there's one of the great Hasidic masters, his name was Zushov Anipoli, and he said that whatever you see in life is there to serve as a lesson for you. And he, in fact, he spoke about a thief, and he said he actually wrote 7 lessons that he had learned from what thieves do in the service of Hashem. So the title of the talk was actually, what have you learned in your life? What lessons have you learned? So I don't know, I mean, you have taught us a lot of lessons already, but are there any standout lessons that you learned from the people that you helped and from the stories that you heard in your life?
So I think one of the biggest lessons for me was that people are not a product of their behavior. They are a product of their circumstance. If we judge people on their behavior only, we'll never get anywhere enough. And that there is a chance to actually help people. That's a very big thing for me, that sometimes I do sit with people and I'm like, why are you doing what you're doing? But I understand. I do have a different lens on now. Another part is that my family, my friends, I mean, and immigrating's definitely made that a bit harder. They're everything to me, and what I do should never risk it. And I honestly believe that all these things definitely have made me appreciate what I have in life, make me appreciate the opportunities that I have in life, because it sounds really horrible, and what I'm going to say about myself sounds terrible, but I grew up at a private Jewish school and I took it for granted. I didn't take it for granted that I had a whole community backing me up and supporting me. I didn't appreciate the fact that I had interfering family who you know, would hate my boyfriends. I didn't understand and appreciate those things. And working in prisons and with criminals, I appreciated so much. I know that even with my parents, I was a brat. Don't tell the kids that I work with now this, please, because I was an angel. But I was horrible to them. But they gave me what I needed. They gave me a roof over my head. They gave me 3 meals a day, and they gave me love. And I appreciate them for that. And weirdly, prison had to teach me that.
Amazing. So before we get to there's a few more questions that have come into me privately. A little birdie told me that today is actually a very special day in the Kree home. And so on behalf of all those that are watching, we want to wish you a happy anniversary.
He still owes me flowers.
Yeah, now, because you said I was gonna put it up when you said it, but you said, you know, when you're going to the prisons, you weren't allowed to wear any fancy jewelry. You weren't allowed to have any. So I don't know if Jason's kept that rule at the house that, you know, you're not allowed to have any jewelry or anything, but hopefully he hasn't. He's going to celebrate being with you another year. So mazel tov to you on your anniversary.
Thank you.
So yeah, there's just a couple more questions, if you don't mind, that have come in, and then we'll call it a night. And also, before we do end, just want to remind everybody that obviously we still have another, hopefully not too many more nights in lockdown, but tomorrow night we do have another talk. Same Zoom link, so you can use the same Zoom link, same time, 8 o'clock. And our guest speaker tomorrow night, it's another fascinating story. Somebody also wants to, who's I guess trying to change the world. Her goal is making 1 million children feel safe and loved through reading. She's really passionate woman. She's done incredible things, written her first children's book, and should be another really great story. So, you know, it's amazing all these nights, and certainly tonight, Cindy, I think you've inspired and given us a lot of fascination and interesting things to hear. But tough questions come in, and I think you answered it somewhat, but not in any specific detail. I don't know if you have specific detail, but someone said, you know, how did other inmates treat each other in terms of their crimes? You know, you do hear stories of inmates beating up pedophiles or rapists. Did you get to hear about those stories or witness that?
So what was quite hard with the sex offenders group, especially, so I ran a sex offenders group, a drug awareness group, life skills group, and court preparation group. And what was quite hard was I got lists from the social workers in prison, and these were the people I had to see. I knew their crimes. in prison, you are not allowed to talk about what you were arrested for. Rumors do come up, people do talk about it, and anyone awaiting trial convicted for sexual offences against children, killing children, there's no tolerance for it. They would get raped and beaten up and murdered even. There was no tolerance by prisoners for stuff like that. Yeah, so it was quite hard because it was quite a lot for me to deal with, to run a sex offenders group and not let anyone know that they were sex offenders, which is why we were so secluded. I heard lots of stories of people being beaten up and raped by inmates. You also had a problem with, in the juvenile section awaiting trial, it was a 40-room sleeper and you had 80 people sleeping in it. So yeah, the crowding was a problem. Everything was against them. So
Really?
I don't know if that answers it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just seeing another question coming from Candy. You spoke about how you worked with inmates after they'd committed a crime. Did you ever work with people to help prevent them prior to working with your Jewish organization? So I guess in that specific role, you weren't really in the prevention space yet.
So actually, so part of it, social development had, like any government organization, stats that you have to achieve. So I had to do preventative work, I had to do intervention, and the intervention was more referrals, the groups within prison, and then the reports. And then I also actually sometimes do aftercare, which was your family group conferencing, victim offender mediation. And the preventative work was, I was going to schools and singing to kids. I learned songs in Zulu, singing to children in kinder about how to protect their bodies. And then a lot of it was more about protecting them from being a victim than it was about protecting them from being a perpetrator.
Yeah. And
then with the high school kids, I would go in and it was more about drug awareness. And we ran a very big campaign that still goes on in South Africa now called Kimoja, which is basically drugs aren't cool. And I ran it at different schools. Children would come to me and ask for help, and I would be able to send them to different organizations to assist. In terms of working with kids after they had committed a crime, the reason for diversion, which I do agree with the idea, I like the concept, is that children under the age of 18, their personalities are still quite fluid. They still have opportunity to reinvent themselves. So my role was to identify what was the problem, where could I send them for support. So I could send them to Sanka for drug abuse, I could send them to Necro for anger management, for like different crime prevention programs that they would have to comply with, and I would have to monitor that. So that was the preventative part as well. So it was all different levels.
What was the youngest criminal you ever dealt with?
An 8-year-old.
Okay, so you did say that. So, and what crime did they commit, do you recall?
This is horrific. It was a gang rape.
Oh gosh, okay.
Because remember, in South Africa, so rape isn't just a body object doing anything, it's any object entering another person's orifice. So he was part of a group, there were about 8 of them.
Someone's asked a really good question, saying that, obviously you've been now in Melbourne for a number of months, but how did you find, obviously, the history of South Africa and the poverty and the, do you think that, and I think you did answer it through your talk, but maybe just to, if you wanted to add anything more, obviously the level of crimes and the culture, do you think that was a big factor with a lot of the criminals you dealt with?
I think it's funny because you spoke about vicarious trauma. I think that South Africa in itself is a traumatized country. I will never negate what apartheid did to anyone, and I think that unfortunately that ongoing violence in the history like continuously traumatized people and influenced their behavior. I think that crime was very much influenced by socioeconomic circumstances, and also from the powers that be in South Africa that unfortunately weren't giving across the correct messages. So when you had presidents being tried for rape, what message are you giving to your country? And you would see things kind of like, we spoke about the pattern earlier, and you would see how things would go in this pattern, because what was going on in the news, I was seeing in the courtroom, I was seeing in my office, I was seeing in the prisons. So there was a lot of that influence. It was funny because I was talking to the psychologist that works at Yeshiva about some of the cases that I used to deal with, and that when people were shoplifting, we used to always check what they shoplifted, and it sounds ridiculous because everyone who would shoplift is obviously poor in South Africa, but it wasn't the case. If they were stealing cheese and polony, which is forced in Australia, they were actually stealing it to sell. So they might have been poor, but they were making it into a business. And so we knew what to look for. It was just interesting to see that where you lived, how you lived, all changed everything. Yeah.
Amazing. So look, I think we've come to the end of our time together tonight, and thank you so much for your wisdom. Thank you for sharing your experiences, your story, your the ups and downs of that journey that you had. And of course, we want to wish you a lot of hatzlacha, a lot of success in your prevention role, and helping the future of Melbourne Jury, or part of the future of Melbourne Jury.
Oh man, thank you.
Stay out of jail, and hopefully do more than just stay out of jail. But if you ever want to, I mean, would you ever consider going back into that space in Australia, or you're happy with the kids?
I probably would one day. I don't think now's the right time of my life. Being a new migrant with 3 young children, and I'm loving Yeshiva, and I'm not just saying it because Nikki's on. I'm loving the Yeshiva. It's really, I'm learning so much, and I'm learning a lot about the Jewish community here, how things work here, even just in terms of Melbourne community. I am still intrigued, and I do think, I think would be, it sounds terrible, but fun to get back into it. Like, I loved it, and as much as I had my ups, my downs, I had my ups, and I do know that some of the people that I worked with, I made a difference. And I saw them 4 years later, and they came to thank me. And again, my Starfish, that's what it came down to, was that I made a difference.
Absolutely. I mean, I work as I volunteer as a police chaplain, but that's on the helping the police officers.
Why you called me a chaplain last night?
I do have friends, and I know some colleagues who work in the prison system as chaplains, and I think some of the things you spoke about really resonated when I've spoken to them. But look, just want to wish you a lot of success to you and Jason and the kids in Melbourne. You're a big asset to the community, and thank you for sharing with us tonight and giving us an hour of your time. And I know obviously all the preparation that came into the back and forth discussions about tonight, so we genuinely appreciate that.